Charlie Allen. I'm a principal at the Chertoff Group. I also am a member of the Aspen Homeland Security Working Group. And I got more than 4 decades, I'm afraid, in the intelligence world. So I'm delighted just to introduce this session. We have 3 great panelists here whom I know. Over the last 10, 15 years, we've been very tactical in intelligence, and rightly so, given their threats and we've been at war continuously. I would hope that the panel could think deeply and strategically about issues that deal with the threats to this country and to the future, and raise the level of discussion and debate. All are great friends of mine, including Robert Cardillo, who used to get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to make my collection board meetings. Anyway, moderating this session is Brian Ross. He's familiar to all Americans. He's the ABC News Chief Investigative Correspondent, and he reports for the World News with David Muir, Nighttime, Good Morning America 2020, as well as for ABC News Radio and abcnews.com. His reports have exposed corruption in all levels of government, leading to changes domestically in some areas. And Ross's work has been honored by the most prestigious awards to journalism, including he has 7 DuPont awards, 6 Peabody awards, 6 Polk awards, 5 awards from the Overseas Press Club, 16 Emmys, and 4 Edward R. Murrow awards. I'll leave it to Brian Ross to introduce the guys that I know so well. Over to you, Brian.
Thank you, Charlie. And no greater honor than to be introduced by a great American patriot, Charlie Allen. Charlie. This is a great panel. These are 3 men who know each other well, can almost finish each other's sentences. They are kind of the 3 musketeers of the intelligence community. Nick Rasmussen, who's the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, David Cohen, who is now deputy director of the CIA, and Robert Cardillo, who is the director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. I want to ask all 3 of you to start by telling me what you see as the great threat and what your agency, what people you work for and work with are doing about it. And let me start with you, Nick, and also give us an update on today's action in Afghanistan, where Abu Khalil al-Sudani was killed, apparently, by a U.S. strike.
Sure. I'll start with your first question, Brian. And I have the luxury, unlike Robert and David, of being a little bit more narrowly focused on just counterterrorism and the counterterrorism set of threats. So when I talk about the overall set of threats that we face as a country, I'm explicitly stepping back from talking about a set of issues that David and Robert will have much greater direct impact on. But when I look at the terrorism-related set of threats we face as a country, ISIL has rightly been a focus of discussion over the past few days with a lot of the different panels coming at it from a variety of different perspectives. But what I would point to, my biggest concern is the increasing number of terrorist actors across the spectrum of different terrorism groups, regions, sects, that collectively together put more pressure on us as a country in terms of our ability to collect information and use that information to disrupt and ultimately defeat those terrorist organizations. Simply put, there are more terrorist bad actors coming at us from a greater array of places in larger numbers than there have been at any point during my career working counterterrorism issues. And that, as I said, has consequences because of the choices we are forced to make as a country in terms of where we allocate our resources, in terms of particularly intelligence collection. So as not to be solely a purveyor of gloom and doom, I would point to the significant progress we have made as a country in diminishing dramatically the threat from core al-Qaeda, and particularly the threat that core al-Qaeda posed in terms of its ability to carry out large-scale, consequential attacks against United States interests and potentially the homeland. And even as we talk about the wide array of threats we do face as a country, scale matters in my mind. And none of the terrorist actors that we are confronting on the stage at present have at their ready disposal right now the ability to carry out attacks of that size and scale. And that should not be lost. So when I'm often asked, are things worse now than ever, I don't default to that position, and it's for that reason. With respect to your other question, Brian, Abu Khalil al-Sudani, in recent days, DOD was able to take military action and remove from the battlefield one of the very few remaining senior figures in core al-Qaeda. And from an analytical perspective, which is what my agency brings to the table, we looked at this as a particularly important moment in the effort to defeat core al-Qaeda, because al-Sudani was one of the very, very, very few senior figures left with credibility across the landscape of senior al-Qaeda figures, not just in Afghanistan and Pakistan, but around the world. One of the very, very few individuals who had the runtime, the set of relationships, the network to play a role in continuing to try to guide the core al-Qaeda organization. So his removal from the battlefield just amplifies, I think, what we've all been seeing over the last few years, which is a steady march in the degradation of core al-Qaeda's ability not only to threaten us, but to carry out its core functions as a terrorist organization. Witness the fact that you do not see Ayman al-Zawahiri in active media discussions right now countering ISIL or talking about al-Qaeda succession in the wake of the removal of al-Waishi in Yemen. Those are tells. That tells you that the organization simply doesn't have the ability to carry out some of its core functions of running a terrorist organization. I'll stop there, Brian.
So more terrorists coming at us than ever before, but less of a threat is what you're saying?
Again, you got to put the word scale in there somehow, because I don't default to more or less or bigger or smaller or greater or lesser unless I can unpack it and talk about what kind of threat we're talking about.
Robert Cardillo, from your point of view, what do you see as the greatest threat, and what are you doing at NGA about it?
Thank you. Happy to be here. A quick comment. Charlie recognized the fact that I didn't show up late for a 3 o'clock 0300 collection board meeting. You might think, what a dedicated public servant, what a professional. No, it's survival. You showed up late once to Charlie's meetings, and that was it. But it's great to have you here, Charlie. So first, even though I can't imagine a more well-informed audience than this, can I give a little bit about the agency that I run? Privileged to lead. On the simplest end, you should think of us as a spatial and temporal reference point. We take the collection and the analysis that both David and Nick represent, and we put it into a reference point to help people understand it. On top of that reference, we then add a so what piece to it, and I'll get to your question here. So what are we doing about it? 3 components, and while we can talk more about threat, I'd like to talk about some opportunities that I see from this seat as director of NGA. First one is transparency. My profession, we have a natural benefit. We can and should and will be more transparent, not just with my colleagues here on the stage, but with you all in academia, with you all in industry, and quite frankly, with you all, my international partners. It's in the nature of the sources that we use that we have that opportunity. The second one are partnerships, this forum, for example. For a long time, you could be in my profession and succeed in the closed environment. Triple locked doors, lots of badges, lots of security, lots of high classification, et cetera. And we're quite proud of that history. But that won't get us to where we need to go in the future. We will continue to have to do that for particular problem sets, North Korea, Iran, Russia, China, et cetera. But we're going to have to find a way to take advantage of that transparency in these partnerships. And finally is this commercial revolution in my business, our profession. Many of you are well aware of what's happening in the commercial marketplace to provide additional sensors that are going to see this planet in ways that have never been seen before. In some ways, my colleagues see this as a threat. I see it as a huge opportunity. And I intend to take the agency to ride on top of, not compete with, to leverage all those new capabilities, add exquisite capability on top, whether that's technology or experience or expertise, but do it in a way that can be more useful. And again, whether it's on the unclassified side, as it was in West Africa for Ebola, or the earthquake in Nepal, or the growing openness of the Arctic, where we can and should be open, or helping the administration and Congress understand the nuances of what's going on in Iran, for example.
David Cohen, as the new man at the CIA,
Yeah.
number 2 man there, what do you see your agency doing better than it's done before in addressing the threat? And you have many threats you look at.
Sure.
Where are you focused mostly?
Well, first of all, Brian, great to be here. It's great to be here with Nick and Robert, 2 gentlemen who I've had the pleasure to serve with and to learn from over the past 6.5 years. Look, at the agency, we have responsibility of looking across the globe outside of the United States for the threats that are sort of most urgent, as well as trying to look a little bit over the horizon and understand what we should be focused on so that we can prepare policymakers so that they are not surprised by developments in the world. What we are doing at the agency to be sure that we are sort of optimally positioned to do that is we are in the midst of the first significant strategic modernization, reorganization in the close to 70-year history of the agency. And it is driven by 2 fundamental dynamics. The first is the scale, the scope, the diversity, the complexity of the threats and the issues that confront us today. I think if you look at sort of instability measures in the world today, over the last 3 years, there's more instability than there has been in several decades, I think since the fall of the Soviet Union. And the range of these issues, from the terrorism challenge that Nick focuses on, as we have made progress with respect to core al-Qaeda, obviously we've seen the rise of ISIL, the rise of al-Qaeda affiliates around the world. So there is a persistent threat on the terrorist front. But you look at Russia, you look at China. There was a great panel earlier today on the issues in the South China Sea, very significant issues. You look at North Korea, you look at Yemen, you look at Libya, Iraq, Syria. There are a plethora of very difficult problems out there. And so that, combined with the fact that we are all now living and the agency is now operating in a digital world where there is not only great opportunity to take advantage of what exists in the digital domain, but there are also real challenges in how we go about doing our business because of the fact that we operate in the digital world. So those 2 dynamics of the range and complexity of the issues and the fact that we are operating much more in a digital world have led us to this strategic modernization. And I'll just sort of tick through quickly the core elements of it. One is that we are setting up for the first time in many decades a new directorate, a directorate of digital innovation that is going to focus the agency's efforts both defensively and offensively in the digital domain. I can talk more about that later. Secondly, we are creating 10 mission centers, which are going to be integrated elements, 6 of which are focused on regions, 4 of which are focused on functional areas, but integrated elements that pull together our operators, our analysts, our support, and our technologists, and soon our new digital domain, to work together to pursue the particular issues that the mission center is confronting. And the third piece, sort of recognizing that the agency is only effective to the extent that we have great employees who continue to get recruited, trained, and developed, is we are creating a talent center of excellence that will, from birth to retirement, focus on our officers, on the development of our officers, giving them opportunities, giving them training, doing leadership development. So those 3 sort of structural changes are all designed to make the agency better at pursuing the range of issues that we see today and doing it in the digital landscape.
What each of you seem to describe is that the good old days of spying are the good old days. They're over. And now you're dealing with a Facebook, Twitter world that has created instability in some cases and then can be harnessed, I take it, Nick. How do you use that, or can you use it?
Well, you hit on something with what you said about not being the good old days. And in some ways, for intelligence analysts, and I, as is David, we are not career intelligence professionals in the same way that Robert is. We held leadership positions in intelligence agencies, but I learn every day what it means to be an intelligence professional by watching my young analysts work. And it's interesting watching the transformation they're going through, where even just the last couple of years when I was serving as deputy director, we'd have a terrorist incident happen, and we would default to looking at the most sensitive intelligence we could collect, whether it was signals intelligence collected by our NSA or clandestinely acquired intelligence from DOD or CIA, and figure out what does it mean? What does it tell us about this terrorism event? And often we'd have literally nothing, sometimes a report or two in the first 24 hours after an event. But if you look to the big wide world of information, there was an explosion of information about what had happened, who was culpable, who was involved, what the motivations were. Now, there's still a lot of work to be done before you translate that pile of information into intelligence analysis, and I didn't exactly ask our analysts to simply take what they were seeing on Twitter and turn it into an article for the President's Daily Brief. That would be inappropriate. But I think our analysts are opening their minds to the idea that what we're calling PAI, publicly available information, is a treasure trove of information for intelligence analysis, both on strategic intelligence analysis of the sort David was talking about, looking over the horizon for what's coming, but also tactical analysis, figuring out plots, who's doing what to try to get to us. And presumably for my DoD colleagues, it's also playing a role in the targeting effort, giving us insights into individuals and where they might be located and whether they might be accessible for disruption operations. So that's the positive side of this information explosion. It does not come without challenge, because I don't know that we are properly equipped technologically yet, and certainly from a training perspective, to have all of our analysts operating at maximum RPM in that effort. And that's what worries me. If there's something that keeps me up at night, it's not any particular terrorism threat or terrorism threat. It's are we adapting fast enough to this new environment? And am I, along with my leadership team, making the right decisions to give those talented young analysts everything they need?
Well, that's a question, I think, for both of you. Are we fast enough? Are a bunch of stodgy old guys who can't keep up? How do you keep up with what is moving so fast?
So let me pick up on the good old days.
And do you need all your fancy satellites with Facebook and Twitter?
Yes. But I'll speak more to that. So I like the comment, the good old days. I mean, when young Bobby Cardillo was an analyst at his light table in those good old days, we had a monopoly. We had a monopoly on what flew. We highly classified it. By the way, no one else could afford it to do it anyway, even if they wanted to. And that's a comfortable world. And oh, by the way, we had an adversary that was big and scary in a lot of ways, but nice and slow, right? So I could take my time and do my work. Those days are long over. So when you say, how do we make sure we're taking advantage of today? One, maybe I'm in a different place than Nick just was at his worry. My worry is less the technology. I'm confident this room or that scholarly table at the middle will figure out the technology piece. I worry much more about my the culture of my agency. And while I couldn't be more thrilled with the talent that I have on board, I'm raising the talent with my peers, okay, the old stodgy guys. And if we're not very careful, we will suppress. And that suppression, by the way, will cause them to leave, all right, anyway, because they won't thrive in such an environment. It's a long way to say, I mean, I'm just starting this with a conversation, Brian. I'm trying to say that we're opening up. We're actually doing a Pathfinder project that's completely in the open. There'll be no classified sources, and we're going to tackle intelligence problems. Now, many of you all do that, whether you're in academia or you're in industry. So you might say, so what? I just got to tell you, from a government point of view, when the first thing you do after you get sworn in is sign 18 documents that you will not disclose, that mentality gets insular. And so again, it's more of an atmospheric for me, just trying to change that dynamic.
So we are also working to change that dynamic and to harness the sort of the energy that these, the table of scholars and industry here and others have, particularly in this digital era. So we're doing this, I would say, in two significant ways. So this new digital directorate, we are creating this whole new career service where we will bring in people and take people who are in the agency already working on these issues to focus them on how we can really leverage what exists, whether it's on Twitter and Facebook or in the open source environment. There is an enormous amount, as everybody knows, an enormous amount of information out there that we can use not just after the fact to understand what happened, but really to give us indication and warning about what may come. And it requires a lot of technological development, technological know-how. We need to develop new tools, and we need to attract young folks who will come work for the agency to understand this new world. So that is something that we are extremely focused on, and making sure that as we develop this new digital directorate, we're creating career opportunities for people to make use of what is in the open source, and frankly, to combine it with all of the great collection that we obtain through our human sources, through signals intelligence, through all of the various ways that we collect intelligence.
So nuts and bolts, for instance, and each of you helped us here understand, how will that help you find where Baghdadi is, or where ISIS is headquartered, or where American hostages might be held? How does that really affect what you do?
Maybe I'll start, because I do this from the most broad perspective and work our way down to Nick, whose center exists to answer that specific question. Again, remember that reference point that I provide? That reference isn't just spatial, the map or the chart or the image that you might be familiar with. It's activity over time. So what is normal, okay? What is abnormal? What fits? What doesn't fit?
Looking for patterns.
Absolutely, because obviously, as we've gone through this global engagement, the adversaries learned, okay, either from disclosures or experience. Some of it's very Darwinian. What works and what doesn't work for them. So it's incumbent on me to work those subtler signatures. What I'm excited about the commercial revolution, all right, this advent of additional sensors, gives me more opportunity to turn that chaos into coherence. Now, that's an easy thing to say, much harder to do, and quite frankly, if anything I'm looking from industry for is how do I make sense out of that, what really is a flood of data today, is going to be a torrent tomorrow, to create the pattern that gives either David the tip or Nick the analytic insight.
And just to sort of roll the flow here, we benefit enormously from what Robert and his folks provide to us. Our comparative advantage is in human intelligence, in running sources, in getting into the folks around Baghdadi, using the information that we get from Robert, using the information we get from Mike Rogers and others in the intelligence community to help guide the sources that we have, that will hopefully lead us to Baghdadi or whoever else we are trying to identify. So, as I talk about the excitement we have around this new digital directorate, that is not in any way to the exclusion of the continued work that we have on developing human intelligence. I think those good old days are still today and into the future. We are still heavily invested in developing our officers' capability to develop sources, run sources, and develop that human intelligence. And then go over to Nick.
And as a organization with a responsibility for intelligence integration, what I find our analysts are doing is trying to piece together all of the different information that we have from all of the different ints, SIGINT, HUMINT, all of the good old days ints. But I guess my point in what I mentioned earlier is we're now adding on to that something that all of our organizations are adapting to, and that is the emergence of an entirely new int, a social media int. Terrorist actors have social media footprints.
Huge.
Those social media footprints can be assessed and analyzed. They can be used to try to create predictions about future behavior, about travel patterns, about past associations, future associations. That all sounds easy and like good news, like that should lead us directly to effective operational answers, except for the fact that we're trying to pull that information out of a tremendous pile of information. Just one, hopefully somewhat vivid example. If you just looked at the number of Twitter followers who follow important ISIL pronouncements on Twitter, you couldn't devote all of the intelligence resources you want to all of the 15, 20,000 of those followers around the world, and including many in the homeland here. You simply don't have the resources to do that. So what our analysts are often asked to do is try to winnow that down, that pile down. This is a little bit different than traditional needle in a haystack plot disruption analysis of the sort we were trying to do in the period after 9/11. Here we're trying to winnow down the pile of potential terrorist actors who may, without much further warning, as we've heard in the case of homegrown violent extremists, who may take violent action on behalf of ISIL or on some other extremist ideology. And so our role at NCTC in contributing to that effort is not an operational one. It is simply trying to help the operational agencies, FBI, DOD, the agency, in figuring out who are the actors on whom we should be putting the most scrutiny and the most operational effort. Because we simply don't have an infinite pile of resources to spread thinly across all of those around the world who consume extremist media.
Since we were here at this summit last year, Baghdadi has risen to incredible prominence, and American hostages were killed. America seemed helpless to stop it. Why was that? Why couldn't we find those hostages? What are they doing that's so good that we couldn't break it?
Title of the panel, I think, as you remember, was A Word from the Intelligence Community. So that allows me to be pretty spare in what I say. But I don't think, you've seen many leaders of the intelligence community talk about the challenges we face in collecting intelligence against ISIL, particularly inside Syria. And it's for all of the reasons that people in this room know well. Absent having a traditional diplomatic, military, and intelligence presence in Syria the way we do in most countries around the world, at the time we decided to engage more actively operationally in Syria, we were operating at an intelligence deficit. And David's organization, Robert's organization, every organization has been looking ever since to try to catch up and develop the best possible intelligence picture we could have. The hostage, I don't think I can top what Joe Votel said this morning in talking about that issue. The analysts who work on those set of issues are as dedicated as the operators that General Votel cited this morning. They live this mission. They stare at the material and the information, trying to figure out what do we know, what level of confidence do we have in what we know, and do we have enough confidence in what we know to put policymakers in a position where they have real options. And we simply, I feel like we collectively failed in getting the picture crisply enough, quickly enough to save those lives.
David?
Yeah, and
Crisply enough, quickly enough.
Yeah, and that, I mean, Nick's exactly right in describing the difficulty of developing intelligence in the Iraq-Syria theater. I think it's difficult for, it's certainly a challenge given the dynamics there. That being said, there is a very fervent effort to increase our intelligence collection capability, working with partners, working with those who have natural access, and to get better fidelity on a whole host of issues. Hostages, obviously, at the very top of the list, but there are a range of important intelligence issues that we're working on. We have, on the other side of the coin, I mean, we have a reasonably good idea of what is happening, both in Iraq and in Syria. It is not nearly good enough, but we have, our DoD colleagues are, actively engaged on a daily basis in activities in Syria, activities in Iraq that are enabled by our intelligence and intelligence that others gather. So it's not as though we are blind in that theater, but it is a challenge and one that we're working on.
So are you more up to speed now, Robert, than you would have been a year ago?
We are, and one of the catchphrases in our business, it's all about priorities and limited set of resources.
Was it not a priority a year ago?
No, it was always a priority, but I will say, at least from my personal point of view, this isn't in my current job, but my prior job, that we, the intel community, were probably late to the warning that we should have provided or could have provided earlier on in Syria. Now, that's hindsight and looking back, but there was a certain sense of, go to old Southeast Asia's domino theory, that these fragile, dictatorial, authoritarian regimes were just going to topple one after the other. And so, as Charlie reminds me, often, key responsibility is to warn, to alert that policymaker that they need to either pay more attention, apply more resources, affect new options. But to answer your specific question, yes, we are tuned and focused and now providing much better clarity than we had a year, certainly a lot better than 2 years ago.
So you really have a much better idea today than you did a year ago of what's going on, what's happening there.
Yeah, I think there's, we continue to get better. And as the resources are dedicated to clarify the picture, it's not a light switch, right? It's not something that overnight you can say, okay, now we're going to, illuminate everything that we need to know in Iraq and Syria. It's a process, but I think there's no question that we are better situated today than we were, a year ago.
And to state the obvious, this is a learning, agile adversary. And so as we move our capabilities, they'll adjust their operations as well.
So they're smart.
Indeed.
Let me just add, in my last job, I was more on the policy side of the street than on the intelligence side of the street. And I think that it's been an ongoing, learning process between the policy community and the intelligence community about exactly what David said about resources and shifts not necessarily translating immediately into capability. We've seen in previous other theaters where terrorism has been a big concern, that when we arrive at a decision to move resources, to shift resources, to start to illuminate the threat and illuminate the network that we need to disrupt, it is still going to take some period of time to reach the point where we have the array of options that we need to do what we need to do. And again, you can tell that story, and I think we've told that story compellingly about our efforts in Afghanistan and Pakistan, because a lot of effort went into watching the core al-Qaeda adversary for a long time before we started to achieve the level of effect we wanted. And then to try to replicate that in Yemen against AQAP, or in Syria against our set of adversaries there, or against ISIL, I think the policy community understands very, very well that it is not a light switch, and that it may take months or years before we have the picture we need to be as operationally effective as we want to be.
Let me ask you, turning to another point here, as you try to recruit a new generation of people to come and work who get it, are you going to create a bunch of new Ed Snowdens who will be working for you, who won't like what they see and at some point, walk off campus with the secrets? Is that a concern?
I'll be happy to start. It's always a concern. Arguably the weakest link, in our counterintelligence structure. It's not the technology, it's not the badge system, it's the human factor. And I have almost 10,000 human factors to worry about. So if you were to say, Robert, are you positive all 10,000 are fully on board and not questioning anything? And I'd say, no, I'm not. But that just means, I think the disclosures for us just is a terribly vivid reminder of how dutifully we have to work on that issue. I'll just finish with this, though, and this is not the reason why I'm raising transparency and engagement, okay? I do think that if we can have a better conversation about the services we do provide, not talking about my workforce, but maybe across the board with US and allied and partners, we can have an amelioration, perhaps, of the tension that you suggest might exist.
Would you agree with that, David?
Yeah, absolutely. Look,
how do you guard against somebody who comes in and starts off principled and feels like he's being betrayed by his own country and has to go public?
Yeah, I'm not accepting your premise.
Okay.
But
how would you describe it? How would you describe it?
I would completely agree with Robert that we have thousands and thousands of employees in our organizations, and it is it's impossible to believe that there are not some who are disaffected for whatever reason. And I think one of the things that we're focused on to try and address that problem, and there are a host of technical fixes that have been put in place so that when you have the humans who make terrible choices that they can't actually execute on them. But one of the things that I think we are also thinking about within the agency is making sure that everyone in the agency understands what it is that we do. And so, we have people who are focused on obviously specific tasks, and we need them to be, expert in that one particular area where they're working. But they need to understand how it's part of the broader enterprise, what the agency does, what it is that we deliver for policymakers, what it is we deliver for the American people. And I think the better we do that, the better that we are able to cultivate what we call the intelligence officer first mentality, that although you have a specific role and responsibility, you are an intelligence officer, you are part of this enterprise. And the more that they understand what the enterprise is doing, I think the better we will be able to prevent someone from developing the notion that, what this agency or what the intelligence community as a whole is up to is, something that they can't support. Yeah, I think we're never going to completely eliminate that problem, and we need, strong counterintelligence efforts. But I think we can make efforts, and I think they're underway to try and reduce the likelihood.
And just to add on to that, I think Robert's onto something with the transparency discussion. The more open a conversation you can have with your entire workforce about what you do, why you do, how you do, the less likely there is to be the grand moment of surprise where someone feels like they're hoodwinked into being part of an enterprise which they don't feel comports with their values. My distinguished predecessor and good friend Matt Olson is in the room today, and I used to go with him sometimes to our orientations when we welcomed new employees. And he said one of the things he liked about NCTC is when you walked in the door in the morning, you had no trouble discerning why you were coming to work that day. We had the counterterrorism mission. We had a responsibility to do everything in our power to protect the American people from terrorist attack. When you layer onto that the amount of training we give our people in how to handle information, how to handle sensitively and appropriately information that touches on U.S. persons, how to share information with other parts of the government, what's appropriate, what's not, what is within the rule sets and the legal frameworks that we have laid upon us. I think that while there is some eye rolling as the young officer tries to figure out, can't I just start my job? I think at the end of the day, they also leave knowing I'm part of a rule set based organization that has thought carefully about what's right and what's wrong and how we do our job.
Before we get to questions from the audience, let me ask you just a final question here. Since 9/11, the intelligence community probably has doubled in size, lots of contractors, many in this room today. Is it time to take a breath, take a pause, and sort of right size? Are you too big?
No.
Who will be the first to take a voluntary budget cut?
No.
No. Okay, all right. No.
Yeah, no's good with me.
Look, no one's surprised that we all say no, but take a look at the world today. I think there are, as I was saying earlier, there are so many challenges, and there is such a demand to understand not just the wolf at the door, not just what ISIL is up to, what AQAP may be up to, what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea, but what's going to happen 5 years from now? What is this guy in North Korea thinking? It's a pretty important question. And you can go across the globe. It's not as though the threats and the challenges facing our country, facing our national security since 9/11 have tapered off. If anything, they've expanded. And so for sure, the intelligence community has grown in size. It has abundant resources. But I can tell you, there are not a lot of people running around the CIA looking for something to do. And I'm sure it's true at these guys' agencies also.
And I'll buy into your premise for a second and then rebut it.
Okay.
Certainly in the period after 9/11, with all of the intelligence organizations, there was a large degree of growth, particularly in those focused on the CT part of the mission. All of the different IC organizations that had a CT counterterrorism focused component grew larger. That was natural. Everybody had a surge in mission requirements to support their own operations. Plus, there was just an endless appetite for intelligence analysis across the whole community. There's no question that we then within the last few years, realized there did need to be some rationalization in that effort and some effort to avoid too much duplication in each other's analysis particularly. And we are well embarked on efforts at NCTC with our partners at DoD, the Defense Intelligence Agency, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, to take a more rational approach to who does what so that we're not all chasing the soccer ball in the same way. But if Director Clapper were here and he was talking about the big intelligence community resource picture, shaving a couple dozen analysts off of DIA's roles or FBI's roles or NCTC's roles to rationalize analytical production is going to save the taxpayer precious few dollars off the billions of dollars of intelligence spending that we as a country invest in. So yes, there's an effort to be more rational about this, but I don't want to leave anybody with the impression that if we just stopped duplicating each other's analytical work, we would save billions of dollars. We wouldn't.
All right, let's open up for questions. Yes, ma'am. There's a microphone coming your way.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim with the Naval Postgraduate School. The problem we had with Snowden was not that he worked for the agency, but that he worked for Booz Allen. So what's your view of what you're going to do with all of your contractors? How are you going to get them to buy into the story?
At least for my answer, it would have included my contract base as well. I mean, there's different rules about how they're overseen and how they're managed and whatnot, but no difference in the way they're treated from a counterintelligence perspective.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, we have contractors embedded in many of the operations of the agency, have had for a long time. They are subject to the same rigorous screening process before they come on board, subject to the same counterintelligence requirements when they're working for us. And I think also as human beings, interested in understanding how the project they're working on, the contract they're executing, the job that they're doing fits into the overall enterprise. And whether you call that transparency or intelligence officer first or whatever, I think whether it's a contractor or a staff member, understanding what it is that we are engaged in is equally important.
That's what I would emphasize. The array of safeguards that Robert and David pointed to are the same for contractors for our organization as they would be for staff employees. But so is the positive side of the equation, the effort to inculcate a sense of shared mission about what we are all. I mean, I don't want a culture at NCTC of people with one color badge versus another color badge and feeling like a discriminated part of the workforce. And if we do that, then we're failing as senior leaders. So I would hate to go in front of my workforce and say I somehow feel less good about the contractors who work for NCTC and their level of commitment to the counterterrorism mission. If that's the case, then we hired the wrong people.
David, let me just take one shot as a follow-up. You mentioned Snowden. You didn't agree with the premise. Is there any evidence he was anything other than a disaffected employee? Did he work for somebody else?
I'm going to go back to Nick's word from the intelligence community.
Okay. I gave it a shot. Okay. Next question. Yes, sir, in the back.
Stuart Alsop, an investor. I'm struck by the context of the prior panel and this panel, and I'm really directing this to Mr. Rasmussen in particular. But it doesn't sound like you guys are waiting to get the single or dual key to the encryption to figure out what's going on. Do you really need that? And I'd like to hear what you think about that particular issue.
I don't think I can amplify or take much further the conversation you had with the colleagues from the private sector or what you heard from Admiral Rogers last evening and Director Comey the night before, other than to say, from my perspective, and I know, I keep harkening back to the idea that I have somewhat of a narrower mission, I want as much access to as much information that will give analysts as much insight as is possible within the framework of a rule of law. And so I'm willing to be pretty open-minded about how we get to that objective. So if there is a way we can meet the different imperatives that have been cited in the various panels about managing the encryption problem, I want that outcome. I'm not at the forefront of those discussions, and I'm not bright enough to give you that outcome on a platter. I just hope in the conversation that Mike Rogers talked about between industry and the national security community that we can get there over the next year or two, and the sooner the better.
Yes, sir. Microphone is coming your way.
Hi, Joe Simidian from Santa Clara County. One of the things that Admiral Rogers mentioned yesterday was the importance of the American public feeling assured that I'm quoting now, that the capabilities of our government will not be used against us indiscriminately or inappropriately. When the American public does worry about inappropriate use, do you all worry about the extent to which that undermines public support for your very legitimate mission?
I'll start. Yes, absolutely. And so, you know, we've got an amazing set of capabilities that the government has, right, to image, to sense this planet. And we do it for particular foreign intelligence gain, and we do it outside of the United States. The only way that I can use those capabilities is inside the United States, is if I have a lead federal agency who designates their request to me seconded to them. And then I have to go through a proper use memorandum so it's a very carefully controlled process. And I need to tell that story more clearly so that people who might see us engaged in a Hurricane Sandy relief operation, which should be a good news story, also start to wonder about what else we're doing when there's not a hurricane. Well, the answer is we're not doing anything, okay, unless we have a DHS, FBI, or a FEMA requirement, for example.
Yeah, and I agree with Robert's, you know, initial answer, which is absolutely, it matters to us very much that the American people understand what it is that we do and what it is that we don't do, and that, you know, as Admiral Rogers said last night, you know, that we are governed by law, we are absolutely committed to adhering to the legal restrictions that are placed on us, and the restrictions on the agency are obviously different from what the NGA has. You know, we focus overseas, not domestically. You know, even I think if there were a hurricane, but it is critically important to our ability to operate effectively that we have public support, and the public needs to understand that we follow the law. When Nick mentioned the orientation for new officers, I have the great privilege every month or so, if the director isn't able, I get to swear in our new officers, and I have, you know, sort of 3 or 4 things I say to them, and the first thing that I say to them after welcoming them to the agency is that we are an agency that is governed by law, that we not only accept that, we embrace it, and that as they begin their career as agency officers, and it's even before they take the oath, they should understand that everything that we do, every day, everywhere in the world, is governed by US law, and that is critically important. I think it's important the American people know that.
Because I don't lead an organization that has operational or collection capability, it's a little harder for me to engage directly in that conversation about what I'm not going to do or what we're not going to do. But the part of that conversation where I think NCTC does have an important role is the other side of the conversation where I think we owe a much more forthright explanation to the American people about the level of threat we feel based on the access we have to information and intelligence, why we see the terrorist landscape the way we do, why we see the whole array of national security threats the way we do. And that's sometimes hard. We're challenged to do that in very specific ways. You've seen even just this week how we sometimes have to shy away from providing detail and response to specific questions. But it is an important responsibility, and I think, Robert, you've been had the longest tenure inside the intelligence community. There's a much more open conversation between the intelligence community and the American public about these issues than there would have been a decade ago, and certainly 2 decades ago.
I'm going to go over here for a question, but let me ask you just as follow up on that. Is there a danger of a terror fatigue, terror alert fatigue? I mean, leading up to July 4th, we expected, 15 different attacks.
I would say yes, and that's something I think we've lived with in the entire period since 9/11, where we've had ebbs and flows in the threat condition that we feel, and yet I think we as an intelligence community embrace the imperative to share information with our state and local partners in ways that, again, we didn't do in the period before 9/11. And so I'd much rather run that risk then find some way to hold back from the sharing of information.
Can I just
Yes.
add one quick
Yes.
thought on that? As the newest member of the intelligence community on this panel, one of the things that I have been impressed by, I mean, I've been in this world now for 6.5, 7 years, is the care with which alerts like the July 4th alert were handled within the government. There is a recognition that terror alert fatigue is a potential problem, because it is a problem. If we want people to take seriously the warnings and to take precautions, fatigue is the enemy of that. And so there's a very serious conversation that goes on within the government before any information is provided to the American public about a potential threat, for that very reason. And so it's and I have been just being impressed by the care with which that process is undertaken to avoid that problem.
Yes, question.
Eve Hinman Consulting Engineers. Robert Cardillo mentioned the Arctic in his introduction. Can the panel speak briefly about the potential threats posed by the melting of the Arctic landmass?
So I mentioned it in the sense of that we could and should do our work more in the open, and the Arctic I just think is a rich area for that. By the way, I'm not commenting on why the Arctic, is more open to sea navigation right now. Not my job. My job is to report that it is. And so the fact that there is more activity, right, more human activity, some of that's economic based, some of that's security based, is that we need to report on those actions. I then get to turn those into the policymakers to decide whether or not those actions are an opportunity, a threat, or a little of both. And so it also, though, I think the Arctic represents a common area of interest. So I think it's a place, too, that where we can have maybe a more open conversation about shared information, shared understanding, and the like. So from an NGA perspective, I just want to bring more to the table to help that conversation.
Do you have the danger of giving away your tricks?
Sure, and we make those cost benefits all the time. I think they're pretty low in this case.
Question in the back there, yes.
Massimo Calabresi, Time Magazine. What is your confidence level that you would be able to catch Iran if they violated the nuclear agreement? And to ask the question in a slightly more confrontational way. Given Iraq, should Congress trust you to catch Iran?
Should I go first?
Okay. Yeah, I've gone first. You go first.
I think our assessment of the provisions that are in the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that provide sort of real-time, persistent access to declared sites, as well as a mechanism for getting scheduled access to suspicious sites, combined with other capabilities and information that we have available to us, gives us a reasonably high degree of confidence that we would be able to detect Iran if it were trying to deviate from the requirements that they've signed up to in the JCPOA, which the IAEA has a whole set of reports that they're commissioned to write. They have a team of inspectors who will be, under the JCPOA, provided access to Iran. So I think our assessment is that the JCPOA gives us a good ability to detect Iranian deviation from the limitations on enrichment and the other specific elements in the JCPOA.
And geospatially, I'd agree with that. I mean, from the physical nature of that which they need to adhere to remain compliant, I think we've got a very good capability to do that, of course, with the IAEA's assistance. The much more difficult question is on intentions and the like, and all we can do is contribute to any detection of tripwires that we might see or that are inconsistent with the physical agreement that they've signed up to.
We have time for one more question. Let's make it a great one. Yes, sir.
No pressure.
Right.
I don't know if it'll be a great one. Noah Shackman with the Daily Beast. I'm curious about this guy, Fadil, who was with the Khorasan group that was recently taken out. Can you talk a little bit about how he went from being a house guest in Iran to joining Jabhat al-Nusra and fighting Iranian proxies in Syria, and how he made that transition?
I don't think there's very much I can say that would be very illuminative on that topic. I mean, I'll say a little bit about how we viewed him as a figure and the role he played in efforts to threaten our interests. As you know, or as many of you know, we became focused over time on a set of al-Qaeda veterans who had made their way to Syria. And again, there are a number of ways in which these individuals did make their way to Syria. But these were individuals, Muhsin al-Fadli among them, who had strong al-Qaeda historical linkages, solid resumes, full Rolodexes, a wide array of skills and contacts, and well embedded in traditional al-Qaeda networks going back to Afghanistan and Pakistan. And so to see them begin to congregate in Syria in search of safe haven for the dual purpose of participating in the effort against Assad, but also looking to carry out, eventually build a platform for external operations against Western interests, including US interests, that became something that became an increasing focus of the intelligence community. Our policy community put increasing pressure on the intelligence community to tell a clearer picture about what those individuals were up to and what their intentions were. And over time, we developed, I believe, a pretty solid picture of that. And that led to the president's decision to begin to carry out military action inside Syria aimed at those targets. That has gone on now for several months and most recently successfully resulted in Muhsin al-Fadli's death. And he was one of the most significant of those figures I described.
And so today the Khorasan group is a threat?
I would say that threat has been to some degree delayed and disrupted, but by no means disabled.
David, do you want to add to that?
I couldn't say it better than Nick.
Great. I want to thank all three of you for a fascinating hour.